"Don't open it, please," the girl whispered, her voice breaking as the rough rope bit into her wrists, her hair falling across her face, while the jeering crowd pressed closer, their boots kicking up dust around the auction block. She trembled where she knelt, a burlap sack pulled low over her head, its seams stained and frayed, the smell of old grain clinging to it as if shame itself had been woven into the threads. And yet when the tall cowboy stepped forward, coin flashing in his palm, the auctioneer laughed loud enough for the whole square to hear. "You don't want this one, stranger." Not worth a cent, not worth a glance. The people laughed. Children snickered. Women shook their heads, but the cowboy said nothing, only dropped the coin into the auctioneer's hand, his gaze fixed on the trembling figure at his feet. He knelt, calloused fingers reaching for the knot that bound the sack, while she cried again, her voice sharp with fear, "Don't open it!" The crowd leaned closer, hungry for spectacle, their whispers like snakes. "Hideous," one muttered. "Cursed," said another. Still the cowboy pulled at the knot, tugging until the rope fell loose, and slowly he lifted the sack, ignoring her sobs. The fabric slid away, and in that instant the jeers fell silent, for the face beneath was not monstrous but marked by bruises, her cheekbone swollen, her lip cut, her skin pale from nights without sleep, yet her eyes blazed with defiance, eyes that dared anyone to laugh now. The square held its breath, all except one voice, a man's voice, sharp and furious, cutting through the silence with a roar, "Not her!" Heads whipped around to see a rival rancher pushing through the crowd, his fists clenched, his boots pounding against the boards as if he could drag her back by force, and the girl's eyes widened in terror as the cowboy rose slowly to his full height, the torn sack falling into the dust at his feet. Elias Redfeather. I have walked the squares of many towns and seen shame sold as easily as cattle, but never did silence fall so heavy as when the truth beneath a sack was revealed. The rival shoved forward, spittle flying as he shouted, "She's mine!" But the cowboy stepped between them, his shadow stretching long across the dirt, and the crowd leaned in, hungry for the clash. The girl clutched her bound hands to her chest, her lips trembling, her voice no more than a prayer. "You shouldn't have seen me." And in that breath, the square seemed to hold still, waiting for a blow, waiting for a word, while the cowboy's silence promised a storm to come. The rival rancher's face twisted with fury as he pointed at the girl, his voice booming over the tense hush that hung in the square. "You think she's yours because you paid a coin? That sack should have stayed over her head. She's nothing but disgrace." The words ignited laughter in some, cruel and cutting, as women pulled their shawls tighter and men smirked, nudging one another, the crowd feeding on humiliation like vultures circling meat. The auctioneer puffed his chest, puffing out a wheezy laugh. "Stranger, you've been cheated. Could have had a strong girl with good hips and clear eyes, but you chose the cursed one." "A coin wasted," I say. The girl flinched as though each word struck her skin, lowering her gaze though her defiance still smoldered beneath lashes wet with tears. And the cowboy stood silent, his jaw set, hands resting at his belt, as though the entire town's mockery could not move him. Elias Redfeather. In the old days, silence could be a shield as strong as steel, for a man who held his tongue often held his ground, and those who jeered soon found their laughter turn hollow. The rival stepped forward, his boots kicking dust across the girl's bare feet, and sneered, "You think you can hide behind him? You'll be back in my barn before the night's over." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the promise of a fight hanging in the hot air, and the girl whimpered, "Please don't let him." Her plea cut short when the cowboy reached into his pocket, slow and deliberate, and dropped another coin onto the ground between them. The metallic clink rang out like a shot, startling the laughter into silence. He said nothing, only fixed his eyes on the rival rancher, a gaze so steady it pinned him in place like a nail driven into wood. The rival hesitated, his swagger faltering, but pride would not let him retreat, and he spat into the dust. "She's not worth even that." The cowboy bent, scooped the coin back up, and pressed it into the girl's bound hands, curling her fingers tight around it. "She's worth more than all of you," he said at last, his voice low, steady, unshaken. The words fell heavy into the square, cracking the crowd's sneers like brittle glass, and the girl's eyes filled, tears trembling against bruised skin as if hope itself had been placed in her palm. The rival recoiled, his face blotched red, but the cowboy's silence returned, iron and immovable, and the crowd leaned in again, knowing the moment had only just begun, and the fight between them had not yet been decided. The rival rancher lunged forward, his hand shooting out to seize the girl's arm, but the cowboy moved quicker, stepping between them with a force that made the rival stumble back into the dust. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half expecting the sheriff to intervene. Yet no badge appeared, only townsfolk hungry for the spectacle of two men circling over a trembling girl with a coin still clutched in her bound hands. The rival sneered, brushing dirt from his vest, and hissed through clenched teeth, "You can't just take her!" "She's been promised," his words tightened around her throat like a noose, her lips parting in a weak gasp, as though shame itself had been dragged out before them all. The cowboy didn't flinch. He reached down, lifted the frayed sack from the ground, and dropped it into her lap with a calmness that only fueled the rival's rage. Elias Redfeather. Promises in the West were often carved by men who owned more cattle than compassion, and when those promises broke, it was always the powerless who bled. The girl's fingers trembled against the coin and the sack, her voice so faint it nearly vanished in the dust. "You shouldn't have seen me," she whispered again, eyes fixed on the bruises the sack had failed to hide, as if the world had been safer when she was faceless. The rival barked a laugh. "She speaks truth. Cover her up, cowboy, before you regret it." The cowboy said nothing, only lifted her by the elbow, firm but gentle, guiding her down the steps of the auction block as murmurs swelled around them. The rival shouted after him, "She's mine by law and blood, and I'll drag her back before sunrise." But his words only fanned the crowd's hunger for conflict, their whispers a storm building above the dusty square. The girl stumbled as her feet met the ground, her body weak, but she clutched the sack tight against her chest, as though it alone held her upright. The cowboy steadied her with one arm and walked on, his boots pounding rhythm into the silence he carried like armor. They reached his wagon, the leather creaking as he lifted her onto the worn bench, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She pressed the sack to her chest and whispered, "It hides more than my face." His eyes flicked to the bundle, curiosity sparking beneath his calm, but he only snapped the reins, driving the horses forward. Behind them, the rival rancher shouted curses that clung to the air like smoke, his threats promising pursuit. The wagon rattled out of town, dust rising behind them, and though the crowd slowly dispersed, every whisper carried the same question. What secret did the sack still hold that even she begged him not to see? The wagon rattled over ruts and stones, each jolt tugging at the girl's frail body as she sat stiff beside the cowboy, her bruised face turned toward the barren horizon while the sack trembled in her arms. The town's noise had faded, but its laughter lingered in her ears, every cruel whisper echoing louder than the creak of wheels. She clutched the bundle so tightly her knuckles whitened, her breath shallow, her shoulders bent as if the weight of the sack pressed more heavily than any chain. The cowboy guided the reins with steady hands, his jaw hard, his silence as firm as the leather seat beneath them. Elias Redfeather. On the long roads of the West, words often fled, leaving only the sound of hooves and the burden of secrets no wind could carry away. She spoke at last, her voice dry, ragged. It's not my face they hate. It's what's in here. Her fingers dug into the burlap, as though the fabric itself burned to be touched. He kept his eyes on the trail, the leather reins taut, but his voice came low. Then let me carry it. She shook her head violently, pressing the sack tighter to her chest, her breath hitching as though she feared even the air might steal from her. No, you don't understand. If it rips, if they see, it'll kill what little is left of me. The wagon jolted hard, a wheel clattering into a rut, throwing her forward. He caught her arm before she could fall, his grip firm, but careful, and for a moment their eyes met, hers wide with terror, his dark with a patience that did not bend. The horses strained as the path narrowed along a canyon edge, the earth crumbling in patches just beyond the wheels, the drop yawning open with jagged rocks waiting far below. She gasped, clutching the sack as though she'd rather tumble with it into the abyss than let it go. The cowboy drew the reins hard, steadying the team, his muscles taut as the wagon lurched. Dust swirled, the wheel groaning under strain, and a sharp crack echoed, the wooden spoke splintering. The wagon shuddered, teetering close to the canyon's lip, one wrong move from tumbling into ruin. She cried out, clutching the sack tighter, her body curled protectively around it. He leapt down, boots skidding against loose dirt, hands grappling for the broken wheel. His shoulders strained, breath heavy, as he shoved against the wood to wedge a rock beneath, the canyon wind whipping past like a warning. The girl pressed her forehead to the sack, whispering through her tears, "Don't let it fall. Don't let it break." And as the wheel creaked under his grip, the question hung sharp as the canyon air. What secret inside that sack was worth more than her life itself? The wheel groaned as the cowboy shoved the rock tight beneath it, his muscles burning with strain, dust clouding his boots while the horses tossed their heads in panic. At last the wagon steadied, its weight settling with a sigh like the land itself had released a breath. He wiped the sweat from his brow, rising slowly, and glanced up at the girl who still sat frozen on the bench, her arms curled around the sack as though it were her very heartbeat. The burlap had torn in the struggle, a jagged rip running down one side, and through the gap something glimmered faintly in the fading light. He climbed back up, his eyes drawn to the torn seam, and reached out gently, his voice low. "What are you hiding in there?" She flinched, pulling the bundle tighter, but as she did, the tear widened, and a small wooden toy tumbled into his lap. A carved horse, its paint chipped, one ear broken, the sort of treasure a child would hold through every storm. Elias Redfeather. In the West, a toy was never just a toy. It was the echo of a child's laughter, the memory of hands too small to protect themselves. The cowboy turned the figure over in his rough palm, the grooves worn smooth by tiny fingers. He looked at her, his eyes searching. "Whose was it?" She shook her head violently, tears streaking her face. "Don't ask me. Don't make me say it." Her voice cracked under the weight of words unsaid, and she pressed the sack tighter, her body trembling as though she could still hold the rest of its secrets locked away. He set the toy gently back into her lap, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Secrets rot when you bury them. One day, they rise." She gasped, covering the toy with trembling hands, whispering, "It's all I have left of them. If they knew, they'd tear even that from me." Before he could press further, the sound of hooves thundered down the trail behind them. Dust rose, a shadow falling across the canyon road, and when the cowboy looked back, his eyes narrowed. A cluster of riders was approaching, led by the rival rancher, their faces hard with malice, their horses foaming with the speed of pursuit. The girl stiffened, clutching the sack so tightly the burlap strained anew, her tears falling hot onto the toy in her lap. The cowboy reached for the rifle slung behind the seat, his jaw clenched as he murmured, "They've come for you, and for what you're carrying." The girl's sob broke into a prayer, the sack trembling in her arms, and the canyon echoed with the thunder of hooves closing in fast, promising that the secret she guarded would soon be torn wide open. The canyon walls funneled the sound of hooves until it felt like the earth itself was shaking, each echo bouncing between stone and sky as the rival rancher and his men bore down on the wagon. The girl shrank against the bench, clutching the sack so tightly her nails cut through burlap into her own skin, her eyes wide with terror. The cowboy stepped into the road, rifle raised, his silhouette framed against the jagged cliffs, a single man standing in the path of half a dozen riders. The rival reined in his stallion with a hard yank, dust swirling around him as he sneered. "Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you keep your hide." His men laughed, circling like wolves, their pistols gleaming in the dim light. The girl's voice cracked as she cried out, "Don't let them take it!" She pressed the sack against her chest, rocking like a mother shielding her child, her body trembling with desperation. The rival pointed a gloved hand at her, his words cutting like a whip. "Everyone knows what she hides, a bastard shame, born of sin. Tear it open and show the world Elias Redfeather. Cruelty is never content with whispers. It craves spectacle, for shame is only satisfying when bared for others to feast upon." The cowboy's jaw hardened, and his voice rolled low, steady as a storm cloud. "She's not yours, and what she carries is none of your claim." The rival smirked, spitting into the dirt. "Then I'll claim it myself." With a sudden lunge, he spurred his horse forward, swiping at the sack with his reins. The girl screamed, twisting away, but the burlap tore wide under the strike, spilling its contents across the dust. Out tumbled scraps of cloth, a ribbon dulled by dirt, and the carved horse, its chipped ear catching the light. The rival scooped the toy from the ground, holding it aloft with cruel delight. "So this is your treasure? A dead child's plaything?" He dangled it before the crowd of riders, his laughter sharp as a blade. The girl collapsed to her knees in the wagon bed, her hands clawing at the dirt as though she could bury the shame back into the earth, her sobs raking her chest. The cowboy's eyes narrowed, his finger tightening against the rifle's trigger, the silence between heartbeats louder than the jeers. The rival grinned, lifting the toy higher for all to see, and spat the words like poison. Worthless, just like her. The canyon air seemed to crackle with the weight of the moment, the girl's cries breaking like glass, and in the hush that followed, one question thundered louder than hooves. Would the cowboy fire, or would he find another way to save her from the ruin already spilling across the dust? The rival dangled the toy high, his laughter bouncing cruelly off the canyon walls, but in that heartbeat the cowboy moved, his rifle swinging not to kill, but to strike, the butt slamming against the rival's wrist with a crack that sent the carved horse tumbling back into the dirt. The rival roared in pain, clutching his hand, while his horse reared violently, nearly unseating him. Chaos rippled through his men as they scrambled to steady their mounts, and the cowboy seized the moment, grabbing the girl's trembling arm and hauling her upright. "Hold on," he growled, shoving her back into the wagon seat before leaping beside her. The horses bolted forward, the wheels skidding dangerously close to the canyon's edge, dust rising like a curtain to cover their flight. The girl pressed the sack tight against her body, though it gaped open now, its secrets spilling ribbons and scraps into the rushing wind. She gasped, clutching the toy horse as if her very soul lived inside its chipped frame, her tears blinding her to the road ahead. They'll never stop, she whispered, her voice raw with despair. Elias Redfeather. Fear will drive a heart faster than any horse, but it cannot outrun the truth that gallops behind. The rival shouted curses from behind, his men spurring forward, but the canyon widened into the outskirts of town, its rooftops glinting in the distance. The cowboy leaned hard into the reins, his voice cutting through the thunder. We'll reach the church. They won't dare drag you out from under God's roof. The wagon careened onto the main road, townsfolk scattering as dust and hooves swallowed the street. Faces turned, whispers ignited, and already the crowd thickened, drawn by the sight of a girl clutching a torn sack and a cowboy whose silence carried more power than a dozen pistols. The wagon screeched to a halt before the stone steps of the church, the horses frothing, the cowboy lifting her down with one arm before the rival, and his men thundered in behind them. The girl stumbled, clutching the sack to her chest, her sobs cracking through the square. She collapsed on the first step, rocking as she whispered, "It wasn't mine to keep. It was never mine." The cowboy knelt beside her, his hand hovering, his eyes steady on hers. "Then whose was it?" Her breath hitched, and at last the words spilled like blood from a wound. "My sister's child. She's gone, and I swore they'd never shame her name. So I carried it all alone." Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd, their jeers replaced with uneasy murmurs, and the church doors creaked open as shadows stretched across the square. The sheriff stood framed in the doorway, his hand resting on his revolver, his voice hard. "This has gone far enough. Tell the truth, or I'll take it from you myself." The girl clutched the sack tighter, her body trembling as the crowd pressed closer, their hunger for revelation rising again like a tide she could not hold back. The sheriff's boots echoed down the church steps as he advanced, his shadow long across the dust, his eyes narrowing at the torn sack clutched against the girl's chest. The rival rancher straightened in his saddle, his voice dripping with triumph. "There's your law, stranger. Make her spill it. Let the town see what she's been hiding." Murmurs rose like a tide through the square, faces pressing closer, mothers shielding their children while still craning to see, men whispering wagers on whether shame or defiance would win. The girl shivered, her bruised face streaked with tears, her lips trembling as though the weight of the whole town bore down on her small frame. She pressed the sack tighter, rocking as she whispered, "If they know, they'll take even this. Elias Redfeather." Lawmen in those days were not always the keepers of justice, but the guardians of silence, for truth was often heavier than the badge itself. The sheriff stopped before her, his hand hovering above his revolver, his voice low and cold. "Speak it plain. What's inside that sack?" The girl bowed her head, her voice breaking. "It belonged to my sister's child. She died, and I could not let the town spit on her grave. So I carried the shame instead." A gasp ran through the crowd like wind through dry grass, women clutching their mouths, men shifting uneasily as if the air itself had turned heavier. The rival laughed, sharp and cruel. "So she admits it, a bastard's relic, hidden like treasure. Burn it, Sheriff. Let her watch it turn to ash." The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flicking from the girl's trembling form to the cowboy standing firm at her side, rifle slung but ready, his jaw a line of iron. The crowd pressed closer, their hunger rising. The sheriff's hand tightened on the sack, and with a single harsh motion he yanked it free, lifting it high for all to see. Its scraps tumbled into the dust, cloth, ribbon, the carved horse gleaming dull in the sunlight. The rival sneered, shouting, "There! Worthless trinkets for a worthless girl." The sheriff tossed the bundle toward the waiting flames of a torch borne by one of the rival's men, his voice flat. "Best to end it here. No more whispers, no more lies. The girl screamed, reaching out with both arms as the sack sailed toward fire, her voice tearing through the square. "No!" It's all I had left of them. The cowboy's hand shot forward, catching her arm before she collapsed, his eyes blazing as he moved. The crowd's gasp rose into a roar, the flames snapping hungrily, and in that suspended breath hung the question: would he let it burn, or would he seize it from the fire and defy the whole town's verdict? The torchlight flickered hungry and bright, its flames licking at the edge of the burlap as the sack landed against it, and the crowd leaned forward as one, their faces alight with the cruel thrill of a public ruin. But before the fire could claim it, the cowboy surged forward, his boots striking the boards of the square with the sound of thunder, his arm cutting through smoke as he snatched the sack from the blaze. Sparks scattered, searing his sleeve, but he did not falter. He turned, holding the bundle high above his head, its scorched threads glowing faintly, and his voice rang out with a power that silenced even the jeering rival. "This is not shame. This is memory. This is hers to keep." Gasps rippled through the crowd, some lowering their eyes, others shifting uneasily as the weight of his words pressed upon them. The rival's face darkened with rage, his voice breaking as he spat. "You'd ruin yourself for her! You think the town will forget what she carried?" The cowboy stepped down from the flames, placing the charred sack back into the girl's trembling arms, his hand steady, as he guided hers to clutch it close. "I didn't buy her," he said, his voice low but cutting. "I freed her." Elias Redfeather. There are moments when a man's silence breaks into thunder, and the truth carried in the thunder shakes walls that mockery could never reach. The girl's sobs caught in her throat, her tears spilling anew as she looked up at him, her lips trembling with disbelief. "You'd keep me, even knowing what they say?" He met her gaze, firm and unwavering. "I know enough. I know what it cost you to carry another's burden. That makes you stronger than them all." The rival lunged forward, fury shaking his frame, but townsfolk drew back, no longer eager for his spectacle. One by one, they lowered their eyes, whispers shifting from laughter to shame, until even the sheriff hesitated, his badge glinting as he took a slow step back. The rival roared, "You'll regret this, both of you!" But his voice rang hollow in the silence that followed, his threats scattering like dust in the wind. The girl clutched the sack tighter, her body still trembling, but in her eyes now flickered something new. Hope, fragile but alive. The cowboy placed himself before her, shoulders broad, his stance unyielding, and together they stood while the crowd began to turn away, their appetite for cruelty quenched by something they could not name. And as the rival stumbled back to his horse, humiliated before those who once cheered him, the square held its breath once more, waiting for the dawn that would decide whether love or shame would claim the last word. The dawn crept slow and pale across the rooftops. The square emptied of its cruelty, only ashes smoldering where the torch had burned, and the sound of restless horses fading into the hills. The girl sat on the church steps, the sack clutched in her lap, its fabric scorched but mended with strips of leather the cowboy had stitched through the night. Her fingers traced the seams, trembling over the crude but sturdy repair, and for the first time in years, her chest lifted with a breath that was not stolen by fear. The cowboy stood before her, hat in hand, the rising light casting his frame tall against the quiet street. He crouched low, his voice rough but gentle, the kind of voice that carried weight because it carried no lies. "It's safe now. Not because it's whole, but because it's yours." She lifted her eyes to him, their bruises still raw, but in them flickered a softness that had been buried deep beneath years of shame. "You don't understand," she whispered, her hand tightening on the toy horse that peeked from the sack's edge. "This was never mine. It was my sister's child's. I kept it so they'd spit on me, not on her grave. Elias Redfeather. There are burdens men will never carry, for only a woman's heart can cradle another's ruin and call it mercy. She pressed the toy into his palm, her voice shaking. I don't know how to stop carrying it. He closed his hand over hers, his eyes steady. Then let me carry it with you. She wept, silent sobs that broke loose like rivers after drought, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face against the sack. The cowboy lifted her gently, guiding her toward the wagon where the horses waited, their breath misting in the cool of morning. As he helped her climb aboard, the rivals' threats lingered in the air like ghosts, but the crowd's judgment had vanished, replaced by whispers that trembled with something different. Respect. The sack lay between them as the wagon rolled out of the square, the toy horse glinting faintly in the sunlight, no longer a mark of shame, but of survival, of love carried through fire and ruin. The girl leaned into his shoulder, her voice barely audible. You could have let it burn. He looked down at her, his arms settling around her thin frame. Some things are too sacred to let the flames have. The road stretched out ahead, the sun climbing higher, and the world seemed new, a place where memory no longer shackled but healed. Elias Redfeather. And so it was that a sack once filled with sorrow became the vessel of dignity, mended by hands that chose mercy over mockery. I am Elias Redfeather, and this story, like the dust of the trail, lingers long after the footsteps have passed. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been there and the sheriff ordered the sack burned, would you have reached into the fire too? Tell us in the comments.